be avoided.
Professor Galbraith, are you for nationalizing banks?
You know, I think the term is a political misleading term. I learned a few months ago that in 1982, at the time of the Latin American debt crisis, the Reagan administration's FDIC had a contingency plan to nationalize the major banks in the case that a major Latin American country, let's say Mexico or Argentina or Brazil, had defaulted outright on its debt. This was not something that administration would have wanted to do, and in the end they didn't have to do it. But they had a plan to do it if it was necessary because the banks were rendered insolvent by the running to ruin of a major class of assets. Well, we have a major class of assets, that is to say, all of these subprime mortgage-backed securities, which have run to ruin. They should never have been issued in the first place. They are very, very highly likely to default. They were issued on terms which makes them basically unmarketable because there is not adequate loan documentation. And when there is loan documentation, that documentation evidently indicates that the loans are likely to go bad so that nobody outside will buy them. That's a problem that exists in the banking system, and the regulators simply have to deal with it. And I don't think, you know, we're not in 1945 in Attlee's Britain, where we are taking the commanding heights of the economy or anything like that. We are doing what regulators always have to do in conservative and liberal administrations when faced with major intractable insolvencies in the financial system. If you don't deal with that, the problem of fraud and loss just gets worse, and the losses that are incurred after insolvency are losses that fall on the taxpayer because they come against deposits that are insured. So one way or another, until we deal with this, the taxpayer's liability just gets bigger and bigger.
Professor James Galbraith, something I've noticed over these last weeks is this whole debate, sort of re-debating the New Deal and FDR and what it accomplished, and conservatives continually saying that it was not the New Deal that ended the Depression, it was World War II.
Well, first of all, there is a grave understatement in those arguments about what the New Deal actually did. And that understatement is typically because the unemployment figures that many people are accustomed to using for the 1930s don't count people who actually worked for the New Deal. This is Michael Steele's distinction between jobs and work. But people who were building the Lincoln Tunnel or the Triborough Bridge or the aircraft carrier Yorktown are counted as work relief and not as employed. And there were many millions of those. And when you put them into the figures, you find that the New Deal actually reduced unemployment from 25% in 1933 to less than 10% in 1936, and went up again in 37, and then came back down again to about 10% before the war. So a major, major improvement in unemployment did occur under the New Deal. It is true that the war made a major transformation in the economy. It drove unemployment to zero, but it also did something else. It gave the American family, the American household, a financial cushion, which was the war bonds that people accumulated during the war that formed the basis for the financial prosperity of the 1950s and 1960s. And that is what made it possible for the private financial system, which collapsed in 1929, to recover in the 1950s and 60s. I think that point is very important because what it shows you is that when the financial system goes down, as it seems to have gone down in the last couple of years, recovery requires a long time. And the precondition for recovery is not fixing the banks. It's fixing the balance sheets of the households, the creditworthiness of the American family. And the problem that we have here is the fall in housing prices, people who have mortgages that are worth much more in their houses, which is rendering the entire borrowing base of the American economy basically insolvent, and will lead to make it extremely difficult for the mechanisms of credit to work again until you've done enough basically to stabilize housing, to stabilize jobs and incomes, and to make it possible for banks, for any reasonable bank, even a solvent bank, to look at its borrowers and say, gee, this is a good credit risk. And for that matter, for the borrowers themselves to feel, gee, this is a good time to come in and borrow and get that new car. That's the issue that they're going to face. It's going to take a long time and major change. And that's why I say the whole package here is probably not adequate. But it's a good, that said, what Roosevelt did in 1933 wasn't adequate either. It was simply a start.
Professor Galbraith, I hate to ask you this last question with just about 30 seconds to go, but it's about the title of your book and what it means, the predator state.
Well, the predator state refers to the takeover of state power by private interests masquerading behind conservative principle and basically acting for private clients and private profit. That was the Bush administration in a nutshell. The title goes back to Veblen and a bit to my father's New Industrial State, and it's an attempt to capture in 2 words a phenomenon that I think really has transformed our economy much for the worse in the last several decades.
James Galbraith, I want to thank you very much for being with us. And yes, if you were wondering if his father was John Kenneth Galbraith, he is. Professor James Galbraith is economist, a professor of public affairs and government at the University of Texas, Austin. His most recent book, The Predator State, How Conservatives Abandon the Free Market and Why Liberals Should Too. This is Democracy Now! When we come back from our break, we're going to look at another part of the news conference last night, and that's the question that President Obama was asked about Afghanistan. What is his plan? We'll speak with the former UN human rights investigator who was fired in 2005, forced out after he released a report critical of U.S. soldiers' human rights abuses in Afghanistan. We'll be speaking with the attorney, the international law expert, Sharif Bassiouni in Chicago. Stay with us.